Hi, everybody. It's Randy Ray at the Literate Texan, joined by a special guest today, Priscilla from the Evening Reader. And
Hello.
I have Priscilla Randy trivia I can share. We both went to the same school at the same time with the same major and never met in person until we joined Booktube. Isn't that right?
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, I
I
thought that would be fascinating for our,
I think we must have though. I'm like
I'm
we
sure.
had to have had a class or something.
The way my memory works, we might have dated, and I don't remember.
I would remember that, Randy. I
Yeah,
would
you would
remember.
remember. Yeah.
One of us would remember.
I was thinner then, though. So, but
Well, you were still named Randy though, right?
I was, yes, and I was
I
still
never dated a
6'3" and
Randy,
loud.
so I'm pretty sure, unless
Yeah,
you were lying about your identity.
right, right. So, but well, you know who else went to UNT?
Who?
Larry McMurtry.
Oh, well, yeah, I know that.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
subject of our call today because Priscilla and I did a buddy read of Terms of Endearment, which was a really cool follow up because last year we did a buddy read of Lonesome Dove, but never made a video about it. So this
yeah,
year
we didn't get a chance
we're
to.
actually doing Terms of Endearment. It took me forever to read because I was in the hospital for most of the reading of Terms of
Yeah,
Endearment. But
yeah.
wasn't it wonderful?
You powered through though. It was it was so good. This was not my first time to read it. I have read it before. I've read it a couple of times actually, but I just can't ever get over how good his writing is. Just it's just so strong.
It was amazing. I read it before too, but I read it in my 20s. So,
Uh-huh.
it'd been long enough that I'd forgotten it. Of course, I've
Yeah,
seen
I
the
hadn't
movie
read it in like
several
20
times,
years. Yeah.
and I was startled by the differences from the movie because I'd seen the movie enough times that it kind of replaced the novel in my mind.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of I haven't seen the movie in a really long time. Like I've reread the book since I've seen the movie. Like I probably haven't seen the movie since the mid 90s. So that's kind of
Well, I have an
just
anecdote about the movie because I saw Larry McMurtry give a talk at UNT probably in 1992, which would have been nearly 10 years after they made the movie. The book was published in 1975. They
yep.
made the movie in 83. And so in 1992, Larry McMurtry gave a talk at UNT about turning books into movies because of course
Oh,
he'd had
cool.
experience with that because of course there was the
Hmm.
Last Picture Show in Terms of
Yeah.
Endearment, and I think there might have been one or two before Terms of Endearment, but they were casting the movie, and there's a character. There's going to be spoilers in this talk because I can't talk about a book without spoiling it. I don't think, but there's a character in the book named the Colonel, and he's
Hmm.
great. He's suitor number one, at least in terms of Aurora's heart, and he's a wonderful old crotchety man that he's the one who manages to actually become her lover. The other suitors, are just hangers on, but they couldn't think of an actor who was old enough and had the kind of sex appeal that he would be believable as a World War I or World War II veteran, and still be able to seduce Aurora. And they were brainstorming who they might cast, and they finally settled on Cary Grant. And since they made the movie in 1982, Cary Grant had been retired for 20 years, which would have made great publicity for the movie because, Cary Grant comes out of retirement 20 years later to star in a movie, but
Wow.
he refused to do it.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so rather than try to find someone to cast who wouldn't have been very good in the role, they changed the character to the Jack Nicholson character, made him an astronaut and younger and stuff.
Oh wow, that's cool. I did
Yeah,
not know that. I
yeah.
know that I looked this up. I have not read this whole thing yet, but I was reading the sections on Terms of Endearment just to kind of see what I could find out. This is the latest Larry McMurtry
Well,
bio.
I have to get that.
And yeah, I'll let you know how it is. I'd say I'd let you borrow it, but
Right.
um the and they were talking about the originally the role for Nicholson, they wanted Burt Reynolds.
Oh wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That would have been, well, that's the kind of role Burt Reynolds would have played back in that time period, though, too.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder, I mean, it would have made it such a different movie though. I mean,
Oh,
because
yeah.
Nicholson just brings his Nicholsonness to everything that he
Oh, yeah.
does, right?
Yeah. He was so Jack Nicholson in that stuff. I was watching clips from the movie before we got on our meeting.
I was thinking about that scene where they're in his Corvette and they're on the beach and she's got her foot on the accelerator.
Was that, I think that's relatively near the same scene where he tries to feel her up. He puts his hand in her shirt.
Yeah, I think
Yeah. And,
so.
and of course, she's horrified. But that apparently, I saw an interview. He ad libbed that. That wasn't in the script. So Shirley MacLaine was really shocked. You couldn't get away with that kind of thing 40 years later.
That's so
Any
funny.
any grabbing of boobs on screen has got to be in the script now, or you can't improv
Yeah,
that stuff.
especially in the 80s, I'm
Right.
sure.
Yeah. So, but I thought it was just a lovely novel, and it was odd in certain ways too, because the first 360 pages of the novel are set in the 60s. That's book
Yeah,
one.
1962.
Yeah, and then there's a much shorter book two, where that's set like 10 years later. And it
Yeah,
seemed to me like the second part of the novel moved really fast, like it was almost skimming through the events. Whereas, in the first half of the novel, or the first three quarters of the novel, it was like, he really took his time and was telling the story. But
yeah. That's in doing my little bit of research on this, that was one of the things that was interesting that I found out. One was that I've read a couple of his books, like Walter Benjamin and the Dairy Queen, and his book Literary Life, that where he talks more about his writing process, because I was really curious, and that's like the closest that we've ever really come to getting any kind of book on writing or any kind of memoir, right, from him. And he said that he always writes, he knew the ending. He knew what was going to happen to Emma, because also this, at the time, it was a trilogy, because it starts with Moving On, and then it's
right,
All My Friends Are Going to Be Strangers, which is about Danny Deck, who Emma has the affair with at the beginning of Terms of Endearment, and then Terms of Endearment. And he knew that this was going to happen. He knew he was going to do that, but he didn't know how he was going to. He's like, I don't always know how I'm going to get there, but I always know the ending of the book. And he also said that he felt like the last 60 pages of this book were, at the time, the best. And he still felt like, even like when he did Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen, that was some of the best writing that he ever did. He said that that's what he felt. I mean, I think I would agree with that, because you're right. They're completely different in pace and in tone. It does really feel like a different book. And one of the reviewers, I wrote this down, had said that it seemed like, where was it? I wrote it down. Just so I would remember, because I knew I wouldn't remember. Oh, the New York Times critic said the ending dangles like a broken tail.
oh, well,
They
it's
didn't
funny.
love it, I guess.
That's
But
that's the opposite of Stephen King's approach to writing novels. He never knows the ending when he starts a novel.
right,
He's,
yeah.
and that's the criticism you always hear about Stephen King is, he rarely lands the ending.
Yeah, he's what you call a notorious a pantser.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
not a plotter, but a pantser.
Well, McMurtry, I guess, lived most of his life there in Archer City, which is only a couple hours from where I live. I'm in Denton, Texas, still, close to UNT.
Yeah, yeah. Archer City's up by kind of by what Wichita Falls
Yeah,
area, and which is not very far from Denton. And his family lived there, or and he was up there, and like his family lived up there, and but he did travel quite a bit. I mean, he lived in Houston for a while. He was in Denton, then he was back to Houston, then he was in DC. He lived in New York City, and he traveled pretty extensively. He liked to be on the go, he said, in his memoir. I guess you'd call it his memoir. I guess Walter Benjamin, like I said, it's at the Dairy Queen's like the closest you're going to get to a memoir.
Yeah. Well, I guess I always wanted to go to his bookstore
Yeah, I
because
did too.
yeah, and every year I would say, okay, we're going to take the road trip out there to Archer City. I'm going to go meet Larry McMurtry. And I'd already gotten some tips that Larry McMurtry would be happy to talk to you about the book trade, the buying and selling of
Hmm.
books all day long. But if you wanted to talk to him about his books that he had written
Mm-mm.
or his writing process, he would shut you down in a heartbeat. And since
Yeah,
I
that's
had a bookstore, I would have been able to go in and talk to him about my bookstore.
yeah, you would have. You
But
would
I
have.
procrastinated and procrastinated and never made it out there.
I have his book on books,
Oh, wow.
which I haven't. I mean, I read it. I read this one. Just went through like in the early 2000s. I just went through like obsessive Larry McMurtry
Wow.
reading, and I bet you would have had a lot to talk to him about.
It would have been a lot of fun. I'm a fan of his son too. His son's a singer songwriter,
Oh yeah.
James Murtry. Yeah, and he occasionally
Okay.
performs here in Denton at Dan Silverleaf. But he's
Oh,
wonderful.
cool.
Yeah, I think he made his first album in 1989. I was 19 years old and recommended it to all my friends. And I have several friends who are still bigger James McMurtry fans than I am, in fact. But
That's
uh,
very cool.
but yeah, of course, now his son I think is 60 years old.
Well,
That was another interesting thing about this book too, and it's the interesting thing about all books for me these days is when I originally read this, I was in my mid to late 20s the first time I read this, and Aurora seemed like an old woman to me. But for the bulk of the book, I think she's about 50 years old, and I'm 54 now. So it's a very different perspective because I get the whole, she's working on
mhm.
figuring out what she's going to do with her love life after her husband has died.
Yeah.
And my wife didn't die, but she's dead to me. We're divorced. We're divorced, but I mean the same thing is like, what am I
It's a
got?
different kind of death.
Yeah, actually we're still friends. I just make little jokes, but but yeah, I'm in that same position in my life. Am I gonna, am I gonna remarry or ever live with a woman again, or am I just gonna continue to fly solo? I might continue to fly solo. I actually enjoy dating around, but of course, I don't think I've dated some real characters too, but I don't know that I've dated the characters quite like Aurora dates in this novel. You
She
know,
does have a a wide array of gentleman friends, doesn't she?
well, so there's a sailor who comes to see her like twice a year with his son,
Mhm.
and I don't remember if he's a Spanish character or Italian.
Well, the Italian guy, he's Italian, is he is an opera singer.
Okay,
And then the guy who sails his yacht in, I can't remember his name. He is from her younger years, from college. She
right.
knows him from school, from when she was living in Boston and before she met her husband and moved down to Texas. And he's the one who comes to visit her with his boat.
Okay,
And
and they're not my favorites. My favorite is the guy, and he's played in the movie by Danny DeVito,
Danny
but
DeVito,
you don't really get his story
Vernon.
in the movie like you do in the book. He's an oil man who's extremely rich, but lives in his car.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very it's very like he kind of, what's funny about Vernon is like he reminds me of a character from Lonesome Dove. Like he seems more of that ilk than, he's not slick, he's not really an urban guy. He's kind of, he's got all the gadgets and everything, and he's living his life, but he really reminded me of one of the characters that we would have met in Lonesome Dove.
Well, what a great character. And I'm glad we got so much more of him in the book than we did in the movie. Because in the movie, he's just Danny DeVito walking around being Danny DeVito, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it's a good movie, but it's very different, right? Like I think that I really like the depth of the book. I mean, they did a good job with the film, but yeah, it definitely, well, and I guess McMurtry said he wasn't really involved. Like he wasn't involved in the adaptation like he was with Last Picture Show. He was not so deeply involved. It was really all James Brooks, who and Polly Platt, who had been Peter Bogdanovich's wife,
Yep.
who was one of the producers and is one of the models for Aurora. Also, that was one of the things that I read doing a little research, which I thought was so interesting. And Emma Horton is one of Larry McMurtry's favorite characters that he ever wrote. He really just loved her, and I was surprised to also learn that he, not for the movie necessarily, but he always, if he wanted someone to play Emma, it was Diane Keaton.
Oh, that would have been great.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Peter Bogdanovich and Polly Platt. I went out on a date about 5 years ago with a woman, and I was telling her about how I'd gone to Turner Classic Movies Film Festival, the first one that they had in 2010. And I drove to Hollywood for this.
Oh, wow.
The first movie I saw was Monkey Business with Cary Grant, and it was introduced by Peter Bogdanovich. And at the time, I sort of knew who Peter Bogdanovich was, but not really. So he comes shuffling up to the microphone because he's 80 years old by now. Okay. So he comes shuffling up to the microphone, and he's wearing sweatpants and sneakers and a blazer and a dress shirt with an ascot. And he's got the great big black glasses. And
he's ready for a Zoom meeting.
Yeah, and he's elderly, and he shuffles up to the microphone. He leans in, and he's got that really deep voice, and he leans in and he says, "Is this thing on?" And I thought, oh no, how long are we going to have to listen to this guy? And I'll tell you what, I could have skipped the movie and just listened to him talk for 2 hours. He was fascinating, and he was funny. He did these amazing impersonations of Cary Grant and Howard Hawks and John Wayne that were all dead on perfect. He mentioned Orson Welles. He talked about John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and stuff. So anyway, I was relating this to the woman I was out on a date with, and she said, "It's funny you mentioned that, because I used to work for a movie theater as a buyer of movies, and I got to see Polly Platt give a talk."
Oh, man.
And she did not have nice things to say about Sybil Shepherd. But
well, no.
I also thought it was fun that Sybil Shepherd has a little cameo in the novel.
Yeah.
Party at one point in the novel, and she's there.
Yeah.
But yeah, what a small world, and the older you get and the more you read and the more you're exposed to things, the more these things kind of intersect in your life too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's kind of like that, like you notice it more. Things start to, you just kind of you just get attuned to it. Like, that old thing about like when you hear a word and like you didn't think you'd ever heard that word before, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere. It's just that same kind of awareness where things start to crop up everywhere.
Right. Or you've been reading a word for 40 years and was pronouncing it wrong the whole time in your head. Well, so something I noticed about the novel, and I don't know if this observation is just me or if this was actually it, but it felt to me like the movie focused more on Aurora and Emma, and that the book was really about Aurora.
Yeah.
Very much about the mom.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, well, and like you said at the start, very like almost two different books. I mean, but I think it's cool because I think we understand, in a weird way, we understand more about who Emma is because we know Aurora so well.
Right.
And how they are so similar in some ways, but it's manifested differently in Emma than in Aurora.
Right.
And it's like, I like that. I think that's what I like better about the book, is that we get to know Aurora so well, and McMurtry is so good at, and generous, I would say, at getting in the heads of his female characters. I think he was, I don't want to say ahead of his time, but I mean, he wasn't in a way of his time because he was so good at it. And and he always has been. I mean, even his earlier novels, like Leaving Cheyenne, which I think was his second book, he's got a section in like the female character in that book's really, really strong. He just, I don't know. He just had a gift. And oh, that was the other thing he said. And he was trying to get, when he was writing women, his mother, he said, was always really a very reticent woman. And she didn't talk a lot, and neither did a lot of his female relatives. And he said that he was always trying to imagine what Texas women would say if they talked more. These strong Texas women, what would they be saying if they talked more? Which I thought that was really fascinating. So it's but it's great that, like I said, his imagination was so generous when it came to giving them a voice and giving them thoughts, because the things that Aurora thinks about, you could think it would be easy to dismiss her as frivolous, but she clearly has so much depth, and she's very serious about trying to, like you said, she's trying to puzzle out her life, and she's trying to think about, she really likes her freedom, but she also kind of feels, because of the times and because of her age and different things, that she maybe does need to be attached to somebody. It's really fascinating.
Well, and her relationship with the Colonel is even more volatile than her relationship with Jack Nicholson in the movie. I mean, there's a scene where he's throwing cereal all over the kitchen and stuff. And but I love the character of the Colonel. I might even like the Colonel better than I like the Jack Nicholson character, because he's constantly swearing and he's always angry with her, and he's just he's basically kind of chewing her ass all the time, and she doesn't take it seriously at all.
Yeah, and he does, and I think you're right. In a way, he's more interesting because he's not quirky. And that's the thing about the movie, right? Like, Nicholson is like, the Nicholson character in the movie is really loosens her up.
Oh yeah.
And in the book, she is really the more loose and kind of free and progressive one. Oh, what did my internet just do something?
No, it doesn't seem to be here.
Oh, that's crazy. I lost your picture. I don't know what
Oh,
happened.
bummer.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, if you can still see me, I'll just go on.
Okay,
Hopefully
great.
that
Well, yeah, the
doesn't look
Colonel's really
weird.
uptight in this book, isn't he? He's a really uptight character, and he's got his
Yeah,
little
and
routines.
it's like a flip. It's like they flipped it in the movie.
Right. Well, another thing I noticed in the book too was the physical description of Aurora was a little bit different, because in the book she's clearly a very much larger woman than Shirley MacLaine physically. It's
Yeah,
mentioned several
well,
times that she's bordering on being pretty darned overweight.
it said that that was the other thing. I've got like all these tidbits because I looked it up, and not like I knew it before. I just looked it up before our call. um, that that Aurora was based on Polly Platt and a woman named Grace David and Elizabeth Taylor.
Oh wow.
And
Okay.
her looks and bearing and the way she, uh, because McMurtry had met Elizabeth Taylor as when he was writing the book.
Right.
And it was something about like how gracious she was, because she was doing he met her in Italy, I think, and she was filming like a made for TV movie. And I guess, I don't know if Richard Burton was in it or not. And they were divorced at the time, but there was something that he said that he liked about her management of her ex-husbands.
Yeah, but she's one of those famous ones who had like 8 ex-husbands, right? Her and Johnny Carson.
I think I think she had a number, and I know that she and Richard Burton were married twice.
Right.
I think she had 5.
Okay. Well, that's
Maybe it was
plenty.
8. I'm not sure.
That's a lot. My dad
It's
remarried. My dad remarried when he was somewhere between 64 and 67. He'd been married to my mother for 41 years. And
Oh,
he
wow.
remarried, and she was much younger than he was, 25 or 30 years younger than he was. And
Oh.
my dad was not the kind of guy that you gave advice to, especially not if you were his. But I was a little concerned, and so I asked him. I said, "Well, how many times has she been married before?" And keep in mind, she's probably 38, 39 years old. And he said, 4 times. 4
She had been married
ex-husbands.
4 times?
Yes. 4 ex-husbands by the time you're 38 is a lot.
So
Daddy
I
was
don't want
number
to,
5.
I don't want to pry, but how'd that work out, Randy?
They divorced.
Oh,
But I
oh,
did tell him, and I had to be real gentle with him about it because I didn't want to make him mad. You know, the last thing in the world I want to
yeah,
do is piss off my dad. I said, Dad,
yeah.
I'm only going to mention this once. I'm never going to say anything about it again. I said, but if she's been divorced 4 times already, maybe it's
Mm,
her.
yeah. Yeah,
Bless
maybe
her
it
heart.
wasn't them.
Well, Daddy's gone now, so I can mention things
Oh,
like that. He lived a ripe old age. I guess how old was he? I guess he was 84 when we lost him a couple of years ago and stuff. So,
oh wow.
oh, and
Oh
just so you know,
my.
we have 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I've got the little timer popped
Okay,
up on
good,
my
good. I've
screen.
got the timer too. So, it talking to you is kind of like talking to Steve Donahue. It's like we could talk forever.
I don't think Steve's gonna like that, Randy.
No, no, Steve. Well, Steve has the free version of Zoom too, but yeah, Steve and I are both just a couple of big blowhards, so we could talk about books all day.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about that right before we got on the call, and I was thinking, you're so conversational in your videos that I feel like I've talked to you anyway. Like I was,
Right,
it's like, oh, I'm just gonna get on Zoom and talk to Randy, like we do this all the time.
right. Well, Steve mentioned the other day in a Voxer message to me. He says, "Man, I feel like we've known each other all our lives." And I was like, yeah, I feel the same way. And I have similar connections with other booktubers like you, for example. Of course, we have so much shared history that we didn't really share, but it was the same, because
Yeah,
let's face it, Denton's
we,
a quirky little town and UNT's a quirky little school, and the English department there is very quirky
yeah,
too. So
yeah,
did
that's
you have
right. That's
did
right.
you have Jim Linebarger as a professor, by the way?
I did not ever have Jim Linebarger.
I talked with
I
him 2 or 3 nights ago. He's almost 90 now.
Good grief.
And then Jim Baird you had Jim Baird though.
I think I had Jim Baird, but I knew Jim Baird
Yeah,
because I was an English major, and then I was a graduate student in English there as well, and I was a
right.
teaching fellow. So, and I want to say I was a TA for him once, maybe.
Cool.
And then I knew Gene Wright. I had him for Shakespeare. You know
Me
him.
too. Yeah, Dr. Wright was great. He passed away a few
Mhm.
years ago.
Yeah, and I had Clay Reynolds. You said you didn't have him.
I didn't
He
have him.
also passed away a few years ago. He was friends with Larry McMurtry. Um, yeah, man, there's so Leslie Stevens, Dr. Stevens, Howard Ford. I mean, there were just all those
Lloyd Parks.
professors. Who?
Lloyd Parks.
Lloyd Parks. Oh, I had him. I had a class with him. I had Continental European fiction with
That's the
him.
one I took too.
He was great. When did you see? Did we have a class together? Do you
We
remember
might
what
have
semester
we
you
might
took
have
it?
had a class together and stuff. But those books were great too. It was a great reading list.
I loved that class. That was one of my favorite classes.
Those were really great readings. Did you ever have Dr. Johnny Jatan?
I did not.
She was a character. She was a little diminutive professor, short pixie haircut, and
Uh-huh.
but she was awful. She was just awful. She
There
didn't
were
even
some
lecture.
there were some awful professors,
Yeah,
and
no, she didn't
I
even
know,
lecture.
I
She would
know. I
ask
won't, and
rhetorical
I won't spill
questions,
the tea.
one after another, rhetorical question after rhetorical question. She would grade your exams and your papers and just put a letter grade on it with no justification for it. One of my classmates had straight A's in everything, and made a B, and she couldn't explain to him why he got a B instead of an A, and she wouldn't change the grade. But yeah, I had her for the second half of English literature.
Like world lit?
Yeah, English lit.
English,
You had
okay.
English lit
Yeah, yeah,
1 and 2, and then you had American
yeah.
lit
An
1 and 2.
American lit
I had
1 and 2. Yeah.
Jim Baird I had for American lit 2, which was really great because he had us
Okay.
read the entire Norton anthology. The rest of the
Oh,
professors would skip around, but Jim, on our first day class, he said, "We're going to read this whole book," and we read it cover to cover.
that's
And he said
great.
it sounds like a lot, but it's really not when you break it down over 15 weeks.
Yeah.
And we didn't
Everybody
necessarily discuss everything, but they'd say, "Okay, now you need to read through pages 210 by next week, because we met once a week on Monday nights from 6 to 9. What an experience that
Okay.
was.
Okay. Wow. That's awesome. Well, he was so well liked. I mean, he just
Oh
was
yeah,
so well regarded, just across the board. And so that really must have been an awesome experience. I can imagine.
we had lunch a couple of years ago, and I've been meaning to have lunch with him again, but I don't really drive anymore because I've been ill
Oh,
myself, and he
yeah.
doesn't drive. So, but
Oh,
Jim Barrett's who turned me on to Larry McMurtry in the first place.
really?
We read Horseman Pass By in my freshman humanities course
Oh,
because
cool.
I was in the honors program, and
Uh-huh.
instead of taking world literature 1 and 2, we had humanities 1 and 2, and they were
Yeah.
tip-top courses. And so I had Jim Barrett and Anthony D'Amico, who was a Greek professor, and
Oh, wow.
so we read the Aeneid, but we also read uh, Horseman Pass By.
That's
We read
very
a
cool.
comic book called Comanche Moon. I think it was called Comanche Moon. It might have been called something
Uh-huh.
else. I probably got it confused with the Larry McMurtry novels. So. But yeah, so back to the book though. So I read, and I didn't realize this. I knew that McMurtry had written a series of books called his Houston series, and that it was originally a trilogy.
Mhm.
But I guess it eventually became 6 books in a row.
I think it's that's right. It's 5 or 6 books.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's Evening Star, and which is about Aurora, and then there's one about Patsy. Um I
I,
can't
I
remember the
saw the
name of it.
Evening Star, and it was just as bad a movie as they said it was.
Uh, wasn't Shirley MacLaine in that too?
She was in that, and so was Jack Nicholson, and the Colonel is actually in that. They
Oh,
cast someone
weird.
as the Colonel, and of course, but he's old and not very fiery in it.
Hmm.
But yeah, I didn't realize. I
Some
guess
Can
he
Whistle.
wrote
I think that was the one about Patsy.
he wrote something like 37, 38 novels in his lifetime, and then at least a dozen nonfiction books.
Yeah, he was quite prolific.
Yeah, he really was.
Really quite
I think that's
prolific.
all he did was read and write, and run his bookstore. But
Oh,
the
gee, what
article
a
I read
terrible
about him,
life. I feel so sorry for him.
well, I remember emailing Gene Wright and telling him that I owned a bookstore now. So I spent my days and nights surrounded by books, and my daughters really loved hanging out at my bookstore. And I remember him replying to me and telling me what a wonderful life to be surrounded by books all the time. So, and that was the last
Yeah.
conversation I ever had with Dr. Wright, but it was pretty cool.
Oh, that's very
But,
cool.
but after reading Lonesome Dove and reading Terms of Endearment, it's like, why don't I just have a project where I read all of McMurtry's stuff? Because I've probably read about half of his books.
Me too. Yeah.
And I've got a bookshelf that's full of his books in there, but it doesn't have any of the books that you showed. I bet between the two of us, we probably have his complete works.
It's possible. It's possible. I'm gonna I had it on my list to read All My Friends Are Gonna Be Strangers Again this year.
It's
And
great.
then when you mentioned this one, I was like, well, let's go ahead and do that. But I'm still gonna read that one too. So let me know if you wanna
That's a
do that
great
one as
Merle
a buddy
Haggard
read
song too.
sometime, maybe in the summer.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. All My Friends Are Going to Be Strangers is named after a Merle Haggard song.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a great song too. I love old country western music. So,
It's good
but
stuff.
I can't think of anyone that I could compare Larry McMurtry to as a writer either. You know,
No,
because
I agree.
you
I
know,
think he's very singular that way.
yeah, yeah. You know, he's almost, his writing is so accessible, like Stephen King's, but there's not a hint of supernatural or horror in any of his books. But yeah, this is just marvelous. So I would recommend this to anybody. Really,
Yeah, I would too.
so
I would
well.
I would say that he has kind of a more even like a European sensibility when it comes to his writing
Right,
than he is more like like American writers. I don't know what it is about that, but something about reading him, it feels more like, or at least reading, like people of an earlier time. But I
right.
think, he was so influenced by classic literature. We, I don't know. I'm just babbling now. and it's
Yeah.
the
Well,
clock's
we have
running
less
down
than a
and I'm
minute.
just saying things.
Yeah. Well, we have less than a minute, so we should say goodbye before the machine cuts us off. But this has been so
Okay.
much fun. I can't wait to do another buddy read.
Thanks so much, Randy, for hosting this. This is a lot of fun. It's
All
really
righty.
cool to get to do this and talk to you.
We'll do it again soon. It was my pleasure.
All right,
Bye now.
cool. All right, take care, Randy.
You too.